Your son is the victim, not the one getting divorced. The girl's fingers tightened around my sleeve just long enough for the words to settle. Then she stepped back as if she had said too much, her eyes darting toward the courthouse doors behind me. I remember the way the morning air felt, cool for early fall, maybe in the low 60s, and how the sunlight caught the chipped paint on the metal bench beside us. It was such an ordinary moment that her words didn't fit, like someone had slipped a different story into mine without asking. I stared at her, trying to decide if this was confusion, desperation, or something else entirely. She couldn't have been more than 19, wrapped in an oversized gray hoodie, her hair pulled back in a loose knot that had started to fall apart. There was nothing threatening about her, nothing dramatic, just a quiet urgency that didn't match the chaos of the city street around us. "Ma'am," she said again, softer this time, "please don't let him sign anything." I glanced down at my watch, 9:52 a.m. The hearing was set for 8 minutes. For a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt absurd. I had spent weeks preparing myself for this day, rehearsing what I would say to Daniel, what I wouldn't say, how I would sit quietly in the back of that courtroom and let him make his own decisions like a grown man. My son was 40 years old. He didn't need his mother stepping in. And yet, the words lingered. "Don't let him sign anything." I pulled my sleeve gently from her grip. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, though my voice didn't sound as certain as I wanted it to. She shook her head immediately, a small, quick movement. "No, I don't." There was something in her eyes then, not panic, not fear, but recognition, as if she knew exactly who I was. A car horn sounded down the block, sharp and impatient, and it broke whatever fragile stillness had formed between us. I took a step back, adjusting the strap of my purse on my shoulder. "I have to go," I told her, more to myself than to her. I turned toward the courthouse entrance, its wide glass doors reflecting the street behind me, and for a brief moment I saw us both in that reflection, me in my navy coat, composed, controlled, her standing just a few feet away, still watching. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lobby was already busy, lawyers in dark suits, couples sitting apart on opposite benches, the low hum of conversations that never quite rose above a murmur. It smelled faintly of coffee and polished floors. I spotted Daniel almost immediately. He was standing near the elevators, his posture stiff, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a folder he hadn't opened. He looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in something heavier, something that settled in his shoulders and stayed there. Emily stood a few feet away from him, speaking quietly with her attorney. She didn't look nervous. That was the first thing I noticed. She looked prepared, calm, certain. I walked toward my son, my heels clicking softly against the tile, each step measured. He glanced up when he saw me and gave a small nod, the kind you give someone you know well but don't quite know how to talk to anymore. "Mom," he said, "you made it." I smiled, or at least I think I did. Of course I did. My eyes moved briefly to the folder in his hand. He hadn't opened it. Not once. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime, and Emily turned toward us, her expression smoothing into something polite, almost warm. "We're about to go up," she said. "It should be quick." Quick. The word echoed in my mind in a way I couldn't explain. "Don't let him sign anything." I felt my hand tighten slightly around my purse strap. For the first time that morning, I realized something wasn't right. Not because I understood it, not because I had proof, but because everything felt just a little too easy. And Daniel, my son, looked like a man about to agree to something he hadn't fully read. The elevator doors closed with a soft mechanical hum, sealing us into a narrow space that suddenly felt too quiet, too controlled, like everything inside it had already been decided before I ever walked through those courthouse doors. And I stood beside Daniel close enough to notice the faint crease between his eyebrows, the one he used to get as a child when he was trying to solve something he did not quite understand. Except now he was not solving anything. He was simply waiting, and that unsettled me more than anything the girl outside had said, because Daniel had never been a man who waited without questioning, not when it mattered, not when it involved his life. And yet here he was, holding a folder he had not opened, his thumb resting against the edge as if it were just another document instead of something that might change everything he owned, everything he believed was secure, and I found myself watching his hand instead of his face, because it was easier to read the hesitation there than in his expression, and for a moment I considered asking him directly, asking if he had read it, asking if he was sure, but the words stayed where they were, caught somewhere between instinct and restraint, because I had promised myself I would not interfere. I had promised myself I would respect his decisions, even if I did not agree with them, even if they led him somewhere I could not follow. And the promise had felt simple when I made it, back in my quiet kitchen 2 nights ago with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. But standing here now, with the elevator climbing steadily upward, I could feel that promise beginning to shift, not breaking, not yet, but bending in a way that made me question whether it had ever been realistic to begin with. And then I heard Emily's voice behind us, calm and measured as always, discussing something with her attorney in a tone that carried no trace of uncertainty, no hesitation, just quiet confidence. And I turned slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to observe. And what I saw did not match what I expected from someone about to finalize a divorce. There was no tension in her shoulders, no sign of strain, just a kind of practiced composure that felt rehearsed rather than natural. And her attorney nodded as she spoke, as if they had gone over every detail already, as if there was nothing left to question, nothing left to negotiate. And that word came back to me again. Quick. It should be quick, she had said, as if the outcome had already been written somewhere I had not seen. And I felt a small, sharp awareness settle in my chest, not panic, not fear, just a quiet recognition that something was moving faster than it should, faster than Daniel seemed prepared for. And when the elevator chimed and the doors opened onto the 4th floor, I stepped out with them into a hallway lined with closed doors and low voices, the kind of place where decisions were made quietly and consequences followed long after. And we walked together toward the courtroom, Emily slightly ahead, her attorney beside her, Daniel just behind them, and I remained a step back, watching, always watching, because that was what I had learned to do over the years, not react, not interrupt, just observe until the pattern revealed itself. And as we reached the door, Daniel shifted the folder in his hand, finally glancing down at it for the first time, just a brief look, not long enough to read anything, just enough to acknowledge its weight. And then he looked up again, ready to move forward, ready to walk into that room and sign whatever was placed in front of him. And in that exact moment, without warning, I remembered the girl's voice again, not loud, not dramatic, just steady and certain. Do not let him sign anything. And my hand tightened slightly at my side, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for me to understand that whatever was about to happen inside that room was not as simple as it appeared. And for the first time since this process began, I realized I might not be able to stay silent. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, the kind of room designed to make everything feel contained, controlled, as if the walls themselves were there to keep emotions from spilling over into something messy or unpredictable. And I took a seat in the 2nd row, close enough to hear every word, but far enough to remain outside the center of it all, exactly where I had intended to be when I first agreed to come. And yet the moment Daniel and Emily stepped forward toward the table, something shifted inside me, not a sudden jolt, not fear, but a quiet tightening that made me sit a little straighter, pay a little closer attention, because from this angle I could see things I had not noticed before. The way Emily placed her folder down with deliberate precision, the way her attorney slid a stack of papers across the table without hesitation, already arranged, already flagged, as if every signature had been anticipated, every response rehearsed. And Daniel, my son, stood there for a brief second before sitting, his movements just a fraction slower, like someone stepping into a conversation halfway through and trying to catch up without asking questions. And I watched as he opened the folder at last, flipping to the first page, his eyes moving quickly across the lines, too quickly, and I knew that pattern. I had seen it years ago when he would skim instructions instead of reading them fully, trusting that he understood enough, trusting that the details would not matter. And for a moment I almost leaned forward, almost said his name, but I stayed where I was, my hands folded neatly in my lap, because I needed to be certain, not just uneasy, not just reacting to a stranger's warning outside. And then the judge entered, a brief shuffle of movement, everyone rising, then sitting again, and the process began in that calm, measured tone that made everything sound routine, as if this was just another case, another division of property, Another pair of signatures that would close one chapter and open another, and Emily's attorney spoke first, outlining terms in a way that sounded simple, almost generous, words like equitable and mutual agreement and streamlined resolution, phrases that wrapped complexity in something that felt easy to accept, and Daniel nodded once, just once, as if that was enough, as if he did not need more than a summary to make a decision that would affect the rest of his life. And I felt that same awareness deepen, because nothing about this felt like a negotiation. It felt like a conclusion that had already been reached somewhere else, before this room, before this moment, and then the documents were passed to him, one by one, pages sliding across the polished surface of the table, and he picked up the pen, holding it in that same steady grip he had always had, confident, decisive, and for a fraction of a second, everything slowed, not in reality, but in the way my mind registered it, the small details becoming sharper, the faint sound of paper shifting, the soft hum of the overhead lights, the subtle curve of Emily's smile that she tried to keep neutral but could not quite hide. And I saw it then, not clearly enough to name, but clearly enough to recognize that this was not just confidence, it was expectation, and that difference mattered, because confidence came from belief, but expectation came from certainty. And certainty meant she already knew how this would end. And Daniel, still looking at the page, still not fully reading, did not see it. Or if he did, he chose not to question it. And the girl's voice returned again, not louder, not clearer, just present. As if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Do not let him sign anything. And my fingers pressed together slightly, the only outward sign of the decision forming quietly inside me. Because I had spent years believing that stepping back was the same as supporting, that giving him space was the same as trusting him. But sitting there now, watching him about to put his name on something he had barely examined, I realized there was a difference between letting someone live their life and allowing them to walk into something they did not understand. And that difference, small as it seemed, was enough to make me shift forward in my seat, just a few inches, just enough to signal to myself that I was no longer only observing. And when Daniel lowered the pen toward the paper, ready to sign, I knew I could not stay silent any longer. The tip of the pen hovered just above the paper, and that was the moment I heard my own voice before I had fully decided to speak, clear and steady in a way that surprised even me. Daniel, wait. The word did not echo. It did not interrupt the room the way loud voices do, but it carried enough weight to pause his hand midair. And he looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and something else, something closer to relief than I expected, as if part of him had been waiting for a reason to stop without knowing how to create one himself. And the judge's eyes shifted briefly in my direction, not irritated, not impatient, just attentive, while Emily's posture changed in a way so slight most people would have missed it, her shoulders drawing back just a fraction, her expression tightening for only a second before smoothing again into that same composed calm, and her attorney leaned forward slightly, his tone polite but firm as he said, "Is there a concern, ma'am?" And I stood slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, because I understood in that moment that how I moved mattered just as much as what I said, and I kept my hands relaxed at my sides as I stepped forward enough to be seen clearly, not entering their space, but no longer staying hidden in the background either. And I looked at Daniel first, not at the judge, not at Emily, because this was still about him, still about making sure he understood what he was about to do. "Have you read all of it?" I asked, my voice even, not accusing, not emotional, just a question placed exactly where it needed to be. And he hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough, because hesitation does not exist when someone is certain, and I saw it then. The small shift in his expression as he glanced back down at the document, then at Emily, then back at me, and he did not answer immediately, which told me everything I needed to know, and the room remained quiet in that particular way courtrooms do, where silence feels structured rather than empty, and Emily spoke before he could, her tone light, almost reassuring. "Of course he has, Margaret. Everything has been reviewed." And she said my name like we were still having polite conversations over dinner, like this was just another detail to move past. And I turned my head slightly toward her, meeting her gaze for the first time that morning, with full attention. And there it was again, that certainty, not confidence, not calm, but something practiced, something prepared, And I did not challenge her directly. I did not need to, because this was not about arguing. It was about slowing something down that had been moving too quickly from the start. Then it will not hurt to take a few more minutes, I said, returning my focus to Daniel, just to be sure. And the judge nodded once, a small gesture that shifted the balance of the room, more than any raised voice could have. There is no issue with allowing additional time for review, he said, and I saw the brief flicker of irritation cross Emily's face before she controlled it, so fast it might have been imagined if. I had not been watching closely, and her attorney adjusted the papers slightly, his movements no longer as smooth as before, and Daniel lowered the pen fully now, setting it down on the table instead of holding it above the page. And that simple action felt larger than it should have, like something that had been set in motion had finally been interrupted, and I stepped back again, not retreating, just giving him space to look, to read, to think without pressure. And as he turned the first page, more slowly this time, his eyes moving line by line instead of skimming, I felt a quiet steadiness settle inside me. Not victory, not satisfaction, just the recognition that whatever this was, whatever had been arranged, it would not unfold as easily as someone had planned. And for the first time since we entered that room, the pace changed, just enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath the surface all along. Daniel did not speak at first, and that silence stretched just long enough to change the atmosphere in the room. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make anyone outside notice, but enough for those of us inside to feel it shift, like a quiet current moving beneath still water. And I watched as his eyes slowed over the page, no longer jumping from line to line, but settling, reading, processing, and I could see it happening in real time. The moment when something familiar begins to look unfamiliar, when words that seemed simple at a glance start to carry weight when given a second look, and his brow tightened slightly, that same crease deepening, and he flipped back one page, then forward again, as if confirming something he had not expected to find. And across from him Emily remained still, almost too still, her hands folded neatly on the table, her posture unchanged. But there was a difference now, subtle but unmistakable. Her attention sharpened, her eyes fixed on Daniel, with a focus that felt less like patience and more like calculation. And her attorney leaned in again, his voice low and even, offering an explanation that sounded practiced, something about standard clauses and procedural language, words meant to smooth over complexity rather than illuminate it. And Daniel nodded once, but this time it was different, not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement, and he did not return to the pen. He kept reading, and that alone was enough to make me understand that whatever had been expected to happen quickly was no longer unfolding the way it had been planned. And I remained where I was, quiet, composed, not interfering again, because this part did not require my voice. It required his attention, and I could see that attention deepening with each passing second. And then he paused, his finger resting lightly against a paragraph near the bottom of the page, and he leaned back slightly, not far, just enough to create space between himself and the document. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a question in it that had not been there before. This section, he said, glancing briefly toward Emily before returning his gaze to the paper. Why is this structured this way? And the room responded to that question in a way no one could hide. Emily's expression shifted again, not fully, not enough to break her composure, but enough to reveal that the question had not been anticipated, and her attorney answered quickly, too quickly, explaining it as a protective measure, something designed to streamline the division of assets, something routine, something beneficial. And I listened carefully, not to the words themselves, but to the rhythm of them, because I had learned over the years that certainty has a steady pace, while explanation often moves faster when it is trying to catch up to something it cannot fully justify. And Daniel did not nod this time. He simply looked at the page again, then at the next one, turning it slowly, and I saw his shoulders shift, just slightly, as if something inside him was adjusting, realigning. And for the first time since we entered the room, he looked not like a man following a process, but like someone beginning to question it. And that difference mattered more than anything that had been said out loud. And the judge remained patient, allowing the silence to stretch without interruption, which gave the moment room to breathe, room to unfold. And I realized then that whatever had brought me to speak Whatever had pushed me past the line I had drawn for myself, it had not been a mistake, because the pace had changed, the direction had shifted, and the outcome, which had once seemed certain to at least one person in that room, was no longer as predictable as it had been just minutes before, and Daniel finally closed the folder halfway. Not fully, just enough to pause. And when he looked up again, his expression was different, not confused, not uncertain, but aware, and awareness, I knew, was the one thing that could not be easily controlled or redirected once it had taken hold. Daniel did not reach for the pen again, and that alone seemed to ripple outward through the room in a way no one could ignore, not even Emily, who shifted her weight slightly in her chair, the first visible sign that the control she had maintained so carefully was beginning to slip, and I watched her closely now, not with suspicion, but with the kind of attention that comes when a pattern starts to reveal itself. And it was there in the small details, the way her fingers tightened just briefly against the edge of the table, the way her eyes flickered toward her attorney before returning to Daniel, as if checking something unspoken, something that had been agreed upon before any of us entered this room. And her attorney leaned in again, his tone still calm, but now carrying a trace of urgency beneath it, explaining that the clause Daniel had paused on was standard in high-value settlements, designed to protect both parties, designed to simplify what would otherwise be a complicated division, but the explanation felt heavier now, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way they were delivered, faster, more deliberate, as if trying to guide Daniel back toward a conclusion that had already been decided for him. And Daniel listened, but he did not nod this time. He did not return to the easy acceptance he had shown earlier. Instead, he turned the page back again, rereading the same section, his eyes narrowing slightly as he traced the lines more carefully, and I saw it clearly now. The moment when trust begins to give way to scrutiny, when something that once seemed straightforward becomes layered with questions. And he spoke again, quieter this time, not to the room, not even fully to Emily, but to himself as much as anyone else. This transfers full control, he said, his voice steady but slower, not just temporary access. And the words settled in the space between us. Simple, precise, impossible to dismiss once spoken aloud. And Emily responded immediately, her tone still composed, still controlled, but now carrying a note of insistence that had not been there before. It is part of the restructuring. Daniel, we already discussed this, she said, and the phrase already discussed hung in the air like a closed door, meant to end the conversation rather than continue it. But Daniel did not accept it as easily as he might have an hour ago. He looked at her, really, looked at her this time, as if trying to align what he was reading with what he had been told, and for a brief second I saw something in his expression that I had not seen in years, not doubt exactly, but awareness sharpened into something more deliberate, and the judge remained silent, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption, which only made the moment more revealing, because without pressure, without the need to rush, the truth has a way of surfacing on its own, and I stayed where I was, my presence steady but no longer passive, understanding now that my role had shifted from observer to anchor, not to lead, not to direct, but to ensure that Daniel did not move forward without seeing clearly. And Emily's attorney adjusted his approach, his voice softening slightly as he reframed the explanation, emphasizing efficiency, mutual benefit, long-term stability, words designed to sound reassuring. But Daniel did not respond immediately. He closed the folder, just a little more this time, not fully, but enough to create a pause that had not existed before, and that pause stretched, not uncomfortably, but with purpose, as if he was allowing himself the time he had been denied earlier, and I could see the shift settling into him. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like a line being redrawn in a place where it should have been from the beginning. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that had not been there before. I want to review this with my own attorney, he said, and the words landed with quiet finality, not loud, not confrontational, but clear enough that there was no misunderstanding them. And in that moment, everything that had been moving too quickly came to a stop, and the certainty that had once belonged to Emily alone no longer held the same weight, because Daniel had stepped out of it. And once someone does that, even slightly, the entire structure built around that certainty begins to change. The words settled into the room with a quiet weight that did not need to be raised to be heard. And for a moment no one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because the direction had changed in a way that could not be easily redirected. And I watched as Emily's composure adjusted once more, not breaking, never fully breaking, but tightening in small, controlled ways that revealed more than any outward reaction could. And her eyes moved to Daniel with a focus that was no longer simply confident, but intent, as if recalculating, as if searching for a way to guide him back to the path he had just stepped away from. And her voice, when she spoke, remained calm, but there was a firmness beneath it now, a subtle insistence that had not been necessary before. There is no need to delay this, Daniel. Everything has already been agreed upon, she said, and the phrase sounded different this time. Less like reassurance and more like a reminder, as if agreement itself was something that should not be questioned once it had been declared. But Daniel did not respond immediately, and that pause, that space between her words and his reaction, carried more meaning than anything spoken aloud, because it showed that he was no longer moving within the rhythm she had set. He was setting his own, even if only slightly, and I remained still, my attention steady, not intervening again, because this was no longer about stopping him. It was about allowing him to see clearly, enough to choose for himself. And Emily's attorney stepped in, his tone carefully measured, attempting to restore the flow that had been interrupted, explaining timelines, efficiency, the benefits of resolution, all the things that make a decision feel easier when time is limited. But the urgency in his voice, though subtle, was there, and it did not go unnoticed, not by me, and not, I suspected, by Daniel either. Because he did not look at the attorney when he spoke again. He looked at the papers, then at Emily, and finally, briefly, at me, not for guidance, not for permission, but for something quieter, something closer to grounding. And when he spoke, his voice was steady in a way that carried more certainty than anything he had said since we entered the room. If everything is as straightforward as you say, then reviewing it will not change anything, he said, and the logic of it left little room for argument. Not because it was confrontational, but because it was simple, and simplicity has a way of exposing what complexity tries to hide. And Emily held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, her expression unreadable for that brief moment before she shifted her attention back to the table, her hand moving to adjust the edge of the document in a gesture that seemed minor but felt deliberate, as if she needed to reassert control over something tangible, something she could still influence. And the judge finally spoke, his voice calm, neutral, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to moments like this. It is reasonable for either party to request additional time for independent review, he said, and with that, the structure that had been guiding the process up until now loosened, just enough to allow a different outcome to form, and I felt a quiet clarity settle within me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, because whatever had been set in motion before today, whatever expectations had been built into this moment, they were no longer fixed. And Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the folders still open in front of him, but no longer something he was about to sign without question. And I could see it now, the shift complete, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. He was no longer following, he was evaluating, and that difference, small as it might appear from the outside, was the point at which everything changes, because once a person begins to question, they cannot return to blind acceptance. And as the room adjusted around that new reality, as conversations shifted and timelines were reconsidered, I realized that the warning I had almost dismissed outside those courthouse doors had done exactly what it needed to do. It had not given me answers. It had given me just enough doubt to pause something that should never have moved so quickly in the first place. And now, with that pause in place, the truth had space to surface on its own. The conversation in the room shifted into logistics, into scheduling, into language that sounded procedural again, but the energy had changed in a way that could not be undone. And as the judge outlined the next steps, setting a new date for review, allowing time for independent counsel, I noticed that Emily no longer spoke unless necessary. Her silence now different from before, not controlled, but measured, as if each word had to be reconsidered before being used. And Daniel gathered the documents slowly, stacking them with more care. than he had shown when he first held them, as if the papers themselves had gained weight simply by being understood, and I remained seated until the brief session concluded, until the quiet shuffle of chairs and low voices signaled that the moment had passed, at least for now. And when we stepped back into the hallway, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like something that had been fogged over was beginning to sharpen at the edges, and Daniel exhaled once, a slow breath that seemed to come from deeper than the moment required, and he looked down at the folder again before turning to me. "I should have read it before," he said, not as an apology, not directed at me, but as a realization spoken aloud, and I nodded slightly, not correcting him, not adding anything, because he did not need explanation. He needed space to continue seeing what he had just begun to notice. And Emily stepped out a moment later with her attorney, her expression composed once more, but quieter now, the certainty replaced by something more cautious, and she addressed Daniel with the same steady tone, suggesting they could resolve everything quickly once he had his review, framing it as a minor delay rather than a shift in direction. But Daniel did not answer immediately. He simply nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging, and that distinction, small as it seemed, marked a boundary that had not existed before. And as they moved a few steps ahead, speaking in lower voices, I let my attention drift for just a second, back toward the entrance we had come through earlier, and I found myself wondering if she was still there, the girl who had stopped me, who had said so little and yet changed everything. And without fully deciding to, I stepped away from the hallway, walking back toward the elevator, then down, each movement calm, unhurried, as if I were simply following a thought to its natural end. And when the doors opened onto the lobby, I saw her almost immediately, sitting on the same bench, her posture slightly hunched, her hands wrapped around a paper cup that had long since gone cold. And she looked up the moment I stepped out, not surprised, not relieved, just attentive, as if she had been waiting without expecting me to return. And I walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising my voice. And for a moment neither of us said anything. Because some conversations do not begin with words, they begin with recognition. And then I asked, quietly, "How did you know?" And she glanced down at the cup in her hands before answering, her voice low, steady. "Because I have seen it before," she said, and she did not elaborate. She did not rush to explain. But something in the way she said it made it clear that this was not guesswork, not coincidence. And I waited, not pressing, just giving her the space to continue if she chose to. And after a second, she did, lifting her eyes back to mine. "She has done this before, just not with him." And the words settled carefully, deliberately, each one carrying more weight than the last. And I felt that same quiet awareness return, stronger now, more defined, because suspicion can be dismissed, but patterns cannot. And I realized then that what had been interrupted upstairs was not just a decision. It was something larger, something that extended beyond this one moment. And the girl, Lily, shifted slightly on the bench, reaching into the pocket of her hoodie and pulling out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, and she held it out toward me without explanation. And I took it slowly, unfolding it just enough to see that it was not random, not vague, but specific. Numbers, names, details that did not belong to chance. And as I looked back up at her, she simply said, "You should not wait too long." And in that moment, I understood that the pause we had created inside that courtroom was only the beginning, not the resolution, and whatever truth had started to surface would not remain hidden now that it had been seen. The paper in my hand felt thin, almost fragile, but the information printed across it carried a weight that settled deep before I had even fully processed what I was seeing. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, reading just enough to understand that this was not a coincidence, not a misunderstanding, but a pattern that had been repeated with careful precision, names that were not Daniel's, dates that stretched back years, account references that aligned too closely with what I had just watched unfold upstairs. And I folded the paper slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of control, because rushing would not change what it revealed. And when I looked back at Lily, she did not ask what I thought. She did not press for a reaction. She simply watched, as if she already knew that understanding does not come all at once. It arrives in layers, and I slipped the paper into my purse with deliberate care. "Thank you," I said, and the words felt insufficient, but they were the only ones that fit the moment without breaking it, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before looking away toward the courthouse doors again, her role in this already complete in a way that did not require recognition, and I turned back toward the elevator, my steps steady, not hurried, because urgency now came from clarity, not panic. And when I returned to the upper floor, Daniel was standing alone near the end of the hallway, the folder still in his hand, his attention fixed, somewhere beyond the walls as if he was replaying everything that had just happened. And he looked at me when I approached, not with confusion, not with resistance, but with the kind of focus that only comes after something shifts internally. There is more to this, he said quietly, and I nodded once, not as agreement, but as confirmation, because what I held in my purse was not speculation, it was structure. It was evidence that what he had almost signed was not an isolated agreement, but part of something designed long before today. And I reached into my bag, taking the folded paper out again, holding it for a second before passing it to him, not explaining, not framing it, just placing it in his hands the same way it had been placed in mine, and I watched as he unfolded it, his eyes moving across the page with the same careful attention he had finally given the documents inside the courtroom. And I saw it happen again, that shift, deeper this time, more defined, as recognition replaced uncertainty, and he did not speak immediately. He did not need to, because the silence carried the understanding more clearly than words could, and after a moment he looked up, not at me first, but down the hallway where Emily and her attorney had disappeared, and there was something in that look that had not been there earlier, not hesitation, not doubt, but distance, the kind that forms when trust has been interrupted by evidence. And he folded the paper once, more carefully than I had, and slipped it back toward me. I am not signing anything, he said, his voice calm, but firm in a way that did not invite negotiation, and I took the paper back without comment, because this was no longer about persuading him. He had reached that point on his own, and as we stood there, the hallway quieter now, the earlier tension replaced by something more grounded, I realized that the moment in that courtroom had not been the climax of this story. It had been the interruption, the point where something hidden had been forced to slow down long enough to be seen, and what came next would not be decided by pressure or timing, but by clarity. And Daniel turned slightly, adjusting his grip on the folder, no longer carrying it like an obligation, but like something he intended to understand fully before acting. And for the first time that day, I felt no need to step in again, because the awareness that had begun as a whisper outside those doors had become something stronger, something steady, something that would not be easily dismissed. And as we walked together toward the exit, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, I understood that whatever had been planned for him, it would not unfold the way it was meant to, because now he was no longer following the path laid out for him. He was choosing where to step next,